Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, I'm joined by Deerek Lutz, the founder and CEO of Lean Six Search. Deerek is a leading executive recruiter in the procurement and supply chain space based out of Vancouver, Canada, although, as you'll hear in our conversation, he is barely there. Deerek will be joining us at Catalyst in LA in May to help facilitate roundtables and mastermind sessions focused on hiring and executive recruitment. And in advance of Deerek joining us at Catalyst LA, I invited him on the podcast to have a wide-ranging discussion about both sides of the procurement recruitment market. We dig into tips and best practices that modern CPOs are deploying to build A-level teams, but also what procurement executives looking for their next CPO role or looking to step into a CPO role for the first time can do to stand out from the crowd. So let's go into the conversation where I start by asking Deerek if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
Well, honestly, procurement found me, I guess, in the way that most people find their calling, by accident and then all at once. I didn't really know anything about procurement, but was headhunting in a different realm in the IT space. And I was actually headhunted by a company out of the UK who focused solely on end-to-end supply chain. And that was probably one of the first times that I'd really, found out what procurement meant. And it was a bit of a light bulb moment for me where, it's such a beautiful blend of, strategy and people and problem solving. And the more that I dove into the end-to-end supply chain, the more I realized, wow, I want to stay in this space. And that was almost 20 years ago because, and as you've seen, obviously on your journey with procurement, it's full of some of the most underrated, operators that I've ever worked with. Very, very smart people. So as a headhunter solely in the procurement space, I realized that if I could speak, this language of procurement fluently, I could really build trust, with a lot of the best supply chain professionals. And I never looked back. It's been a super rewarding and rewardingly niche experience to specialize in.
So what took you on a journey from being recruited to be a recruiter to then setting up your own business?
I'll backtrack. So I moved to Vancouver. It's funny actually, because we're going through today with the stock market crash and this whole global belt tightening. This is exactly when I started my career in 2008 in recruitment, was exactly at this kind of thing when companies weren't hiring because there was such a crash. And I got laid off being a recruiter for an oil and gas company that I'd worked for a couple of years. And I moved to Vancouver on a whim. It was a Tuesday morning. I was laid off. It was minus 30 in Calgary. And I said, okay, this is time for me to go and live somewhere warmer with more opportunity. And so I packed my car and drove to Vancouver and never looked back. And so I ended up playing, I used to play a very high level of ice hockey, and I went and played in kind of a recreational league with some folks that I'd met. And the one guy who ran it owned a recruiting firm. And so I was talking to him and looking for maybe a role in sales. I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. I got accepted to do my master's degree in psychology, but I wasn't sure I wanted to go back and do that yet. I go to a recruiter and, within a few meetings, he said, you got to come work with us. Like you're great at this. And I accepted their offer, and then within a year, I was kind of one of the top performers. And that was with an IT kind of contracting firm in Vancouver, more localized stuff. From there, the more interesting stuff happened where that company, as I mentioned, out of the UK had headhunted me. They had learned that I was, getting quite good at what I was doing. And it's a small world. And they were opening an office in Vancouver. And they headhunted me to join them as a headhunter. Started off in a junior role, and I, eventually became the top biller in the business. And their executive team used to fly me, to different parts of the business. I got to go down to New York and Brighton and Frankfurt and Hong Kong and Singapore to help train on my style of how I generated business. And from there, they gave me an opportunity to move to Singapore, and I ran a large part of the business there. And that fast forwards into today. My dad actually was the one that said, listen, you built 3 different businesses now. Why don't you do this for yourself? I think it's
Hmm.
time. And here we are today. We're, a team of just under 25 people globally, and it's daunting, but exciting.
Now, I'm going to kind of pivot in a moment to some more specific questions around procurement and recruiting and the market and things like this.
Sure.
But I can't kind of let this conversation go without talking about your travel, essentially. So, first of all, why don't you tell us how many countries you have been to so far?
Yes. So that's a unique thing about me that some of my clients know and some candidates know, but often people don't.
Mhm.
I built the business and I started it just about a year and a half before COVID started. And so I've always been a big traveler. Luckily, being Canadian, you get the 2 weeks holiday. And when I started working for the British company, I got 6 weeks plus Christmas off. And I literally had no idea what to do with myself. And I'll never forget. I went to my boss at the time and I said, what am I going to do with this vacation? Because to me, it didn't make sense. You're in a sales role, and I didn't really believe in vacation per se, because the more output you have
Yeah.
in sales, the more you generate. And so I was
Yeah.
just like, I don't need this. But he goes, no, Deerek, you're going to be working so hard. Pick a place and go. Pick another place and go. And so I followed his advice and I flew to Peru for the first time. And then I was in Turkey. And then, I went to Thailand. And I just started picking all these random kind of places that I wanted to go visit. And it turned into this huge, lust for for the adventure, for
Yeah.
learning new cultures and trying new things. And now I knew, and I think that I was an early adopter of this, because even way before COVID and before remote work, I knew that I didn't need to be in an office to do my job.
Mhm.
The most productive times actually were times that I was on my own. I would go in on Saturdays and work, or I would stay late in evenings or go early in mornings. And then I realized, man, I can work from anywhere in the world. When I moved to Singapore, you obviously, being from Vancouver, it's much more difficult to travel internationally than when you're in a place like Singapore, where there's so many different countries on your doorstep. And so that's where I started to pluck different places off. And my job, my job never was sacrificed. My performance didn't sacrifice. I think it actually improved, having the freedom and autonomy to kind of live how I wanted. And that led me into, the way that we work our firm now. But to answer your question more specifically, I've been to 173 countries now, and I've filled roles actually in over 50. I think 56 now is the number that we've worked in globally. So travel, yeah, full time basically. Have a team in, I think, 8 different countries as well at the moment. We don't really look at, we're kind of borderless. We see,
Yeah.
the talent is global now. It's, this is the way that it works, especially in procurement. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, when I always took pride in how many countries I'd been to, and I'm very similar to you in terms of that lust for travel and that guided decisions that I took to leave a corporate career as well and become,
Mm-hmm.
set up my own business, and it was for that reason. It was, the ability to live and work anywhere in the world that you wanted to, because I knew that I could get jobs done wherever it was. And I'd lived around the world as well at that point. So I'd been really fortunate to have some of those experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And so certainly, I love the philosophy. Also, here at Art Procurement, we're borderless too. I
Yeah.
think there's, maybe 3 of us in one country, which is the most in any one country. And we're spread all around the world as well.
I think it's important.
Yeah.
The more places that I visit and cultures I learn and food that I try, the more that I realize, you know, number one is human beings are very, very similar regardless of where we are. We're very simple, but at the same time, we're incredibly complex as well. And the more, yeah, I find it's a better education. Traveling is a better education than anything I've learned in a book. Just meeting different people from different cultures, learning different things, and really just putting yourself out there to be open to new experiences. This is how I think people need to grow a lot more, which we're seeing it a lot more. Travel
Mhm.
is a lot easier nowadays than it was, many years ago, and a lot more affordable as well. So, but that's, yeah, number one. If you can go live in a new country or two, or work remotely from a few different places, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, do it. I mean, that was definitely one of the pivotal experiences of my career, was taking that opportunity to go and live and work abroad. And so you talked about the fact that you've hired now in 50 to 60 countries. There'll be a lot of folks listening to the conversation today who are responsible for teams internationally. What kind of lessons have you taken from that in terms of differences perhaps in hiring across cultures and different approaches to hiring across cultures?
Yeah, absolutely. So some lessons would be, again, it goes back to the point where I don't think anything needs to change from a process point. We're
Hmm.
very similar in the sense that if you hire someone in New York City, it might be a little bit easier, for a senior role than if you're hiring in Kinshasa for, in the DRC or something. But I don't think that anything has to change from a process standpoint and from a skill set standpoint and a value standpoint. I think, you know, talent exists everywhere, and as you said earlier, it's borderless, and culturally things are going to change business to business, country to country, company to company. And going back to that, one of the things that my old boss said to me, actually, when I wanted to relocate to Singapore, when I was given the opportunity, was they said, "Oh, Deerek, the culture is so different there. You're going to have to change the way you work. You're aggressive and you talk so fast, and I don't think that's going to work in the market there." And I asked this person, "Well, have you ever lived in Asia? Do you know?" And he said, "Well, no, but this is just what I've heard." And it really made me nervous going there. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, did I just get
Hmm.
lucky falling into the right market in North America, or is my skill set transferable?" And sure enough, I was even more successful in Asia. Number one is because I had that in my mind, probably, but number two was actually the culture. Yeah, there was different cultural difference or norms, and you had to adhere to different things, but at the same time, you know respect and kindness and empathy and all those things don't change. Those are universal. And just coming in and being a sponge and being curious and learning and still being the aggressive salesperson I was, it had no bearing on my success at all. And I think it actually helped.
Now, just coming to the present, and we're recording this early April of 2025, and actually
Mm,
only a few days before we publish, as everybody's listening to this after we publish. And so, in real time, we're kind of just watching right now the impact of the tariff policy that's been announced and the
mhm.
uncertainty across the world, that's driving in financial markets. There's probably a lot of people that are worried about that from a career perspective.
Yeah.
Perhaps folks who are searching for a position right now, either they're in a role or they're not in a role and they're looking for something. Like, what advice do you have for anybody as they're kind of looking at this, the noise, if you will, and all this unknown, and how that may affect, just given experiences you've had in the past with
Yeah.
kind of turmoil, if you will, of how they should be thinking about that in the terms of their job search?
Yeah. Well, I think number one is understand the core impact of tariffs on procurement, especially if you're in the supply chain space, and understand how you can bring value. There's obviously going to be a big piece around cost volatility, supplier diversification, nearshoring, obviously, yeah, and then contractual complexities as well. So staying up to date with this stuff is number one,
Mhm.
because if you are interviewing right now or over the next few weeks or months, this is going to be at the top of the docket regarding discussions. And so you got to stay current with everything. That's number one if you're a procurement leader, and come with ideas, not only stuff that you've recycled. I mean, obviously, procurement can't be seen as just a cost center anymore. It's a true value driver. And so this is what CPOs or heads of are going to be looking for, is someone who's current, someone who is up to date, someone who's bringing ideas to the table, and not just hiring buyers anymore. You're truly looking at change agents, who just happen to sit in procurement. And so not my only advice, but my number one thing would be, yeah, stay current. Obviously be looking at this, be open to dialogue and discussion. There's not one right or wrong answer. I mean, and the thing is be fluid as well, because every day things are changing, and that's just the new constant. So I think going in with an open mind when it comes to a specific job search, things might take a little bit longer right now.
Mhm.
I think that hiring might get put on the back seat for a few weeks or months, because people are just trying to keep their head above water, right? It's a challenging market. So that's my 2 cents.
Now, do you say it's a challenging market, and obviously the market kind of goes in cycles from a
Mm.
recruiting perspective. Are there certain profiles that are not cyclical? There's a demand for a certain type of procurement leader or procurement professional that is going to, kind of elevate above the noise, if you will, because it's so in demand. Do you see certain
Um,
profiles like that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think any category leaders are going to stay there, because obviously some of these companies are going to really need to still hire and drive costs down and negotiate across different categories. So if you're a true market specialist, when it comes to that's going to be a big thing. I think other roles that are going to be really important, or facets of roles, are going to be, risk experts. That's, people who understand supply risk. That you can have a seat at the board, table right now, because they need people like that. Sustainability, of course, that's not going to go away anytime soon with that topic. Anything digital and data driven, all those skill sets, I think, are going to and continue to be incredibly important. The next round would be, we talked about sustainability, maybe like more procurement business partner type roles. So when you look at the category managers, if they have those deep stakeholder skill sets, those are going to be gold. If they can align, and the trust thing is going to come back to that, like we talked about earlier.
For somebody who is hiring or looking to hire, one of the in-demand roles to support their procurement and supply chain team, what are the best CPOs doing to attract, those A players? And then actually after that, I'd love to talk about retaining them too. But first of all, what are you seeing kind of best practices in attracting the best talent?
Yeah. So, one thing that chief procurement officers are going to be doing, I think, is to look at core soft skill sets versus just the category or what spend did they have or what's their specific piece. And I think you need to look a lot more broadly, because there's incredibly smart people out there. And then I also think that you can look at the other side of the fence as well. Not everybody has to necessarily come from procurement who can jump in and do this. If they're incredibly relationship driven, if they're very data driven, and they can forge those relationships forward, I think CPOs might want to look wider across the supply chain, or even into sales or finance as well, for very, very strong people. Your best business partners don't necessarily have to come from the procurement space. And we are seeing that a lot more. People are coming from manufacturing, from planning, from other parts of the value chain as well. And I think, a CPO, is going to look at the future versus just look at what someone's doing right now. So you don't want to just recruit for today. You want to recruit from, say, 2 years from now, because the speed of change, as I said, with AI, with the sustainability stuff, like, skills get outdated very, very fast. So you want someone who has the core capability and the core soft skill to adjust, to learn, to grow, to evolve. That's where you want to hire for, is down the road, not for just now. And another piece is build the right culture. You need to have the right culture in your team for people who want to join you. Social selling is becoming incredibly big out there. Yeah. You want to make noise, use LinkedIn, use different tools to show, hey, if you want a seat at this table, this is what the table looks like, and this is how we got to do it. So your employer branding, your social selling, that's what's going to engage people as well, and make sure that you can showcase your value proposition as, to tell a story that procurement is a career accelerator, where you can get that C-suite exposure, you can get exposure to P&Ls and, global experience. I think that's going to change the game.
Yeah, we have CPOs who will come on the podcast and they have to procurement to tell their stories and use that as a recruiting tool, because it kind of gives insight into what it's like behind the curtain, so to speak, but also sets what expectations are. This is what it means to be somebody who works for our organization, but look at these opportunities that exist and look at the work we're doing to drive change. And, that we're a procurement organization that's focused on driving to a different future versus perhaps doing, the traditional things that we've always done.
Yeah. And on that note, speed, is going to kill. It's either going to make you win really quickly, or it's going to kill things. And one of the biggest things that I've been talking about with a lot of my clients over the last bit is you have to move quickly on good talent. And one of the things that I've been talking to a lot of CPOs about is, you don't need more candidates, you need the right candidates. And, the war for talent isn't about volume. And I don't know how many times they'll have a short list of 5-6 people. They like, 2 or 3 of them, but oh, Deerek, I'd like to see 1 or 2 more. And in that time that it takes to interview those people, you lose 1 or 2. And then, okay, let's actually make an offer to the original person. And, now you're going back to this whole cycle of not finding someone good enough. It's about precision, and alignment with the business needs versus just, volume. And I can't preach that enough. I don't know how many times it's a CPO or chief supply chain officer wants to see 1 more. And then we're back to square one. Now that's about transparency and communication as well, but we are seeing this, a number of times over the last little while.
Is that wanting to see one more because a CPO may be looking for the perfect candidate?
I think it's always the case, right? There's always this, but the difference is when you work with someone like us is, we map the market fully, and when we provide most of that information, especially when you're working on a executive search or retained search with us, you get access to all of our data, and so we present that. But I've had it happen, not necessarily only in procurement, but anything across the value chain where, you're looking for that absolute perfect person, and someone who's sitting on 8 or 9 out of 10 things, but they have the right attitude and the right momentum. This is kind of who we want. And it's funny, we did some research on this, and then a colleague of mine just discussed this, where every single time every time, this is 100% over the last, say 50 searches, that a client has asked to see one or two more people, those one or two more people never get the role. It's never,
Right.
it's not one time with us. Now, I'm not speaking for all recruiters out there, but it's always this. But what has happened is, I think it's like 10 to 12% of the time they've lost their, first choice
Mhm.
candidate because that person gets scooped up really quickly.
You talked about people don't have to come from procurement. I'm a really big advocate of that when you look at hiring, but there's often it's sometimes perceived as being safer to hire
Mm.
somebody that looks like you. And by looks like you, I mean that has the same experience as you and comes from the procurement, from a long kind of career in procurement. I wonder, are there things that CPOs can do to de-risk, bringing somebody in from the outside? Is it about the transferable skills that they're finding in somebody who comes from out of procurement, or is a big part of it kind of how you onboard and integrate those people into your culture?
I think you've nailed it in both. I think it's a combination of the two. Number one, it is investing in that person from day one, because if you hire someone from outside and just expect them to run with it, they don't know what they don't know. And so there has to be, a nice onboarding process. There has to be clear, defined goals. There has to be, incredible training opportunities for that person to grow. Because if you bring someone in from management consulting or sales or account management, or even FP&A or something, there's a lot of really, really smart people who probably have touched on procurement or strategic sourcing, or some kind of piece, whether it's, if you're, for instance, if you're hiring someone from management consulting, they might be involved in procurement at a lot of steps or be part of the digital strategy, but they might not be the actual one running it. If you hire someone from operations or manufacturing, sure, they probably touch on sourcing and supplier performance and engineering, but they're not gonna, that's not the be all and end all. And so
Mhm.
that they're smart enough to have this background, but they're not doing it day to day. So this is where you need to invest in them and put that out. But it goes back down to culture as well. It goes back down to giving people flexibility and autonomy, and letting people make mistakes, that are not going to be, super costly, but they, so they can learn and grow as well.
You talked about kind of hiring for the future, not necessarily for the now. And
Mhm.
obviously, as you referenced, the pace of change is pretty extraordinary with technology. What do you look for in a candidate that tells you, this is a digitally literate, curious candidate who, even though we may not know where 2 years is going to take us, shows the skills to figure it out along the way, as opposed to just be happy with the status quo or be fearful
Yeah.
of what may come.
Well, I mean, hiring for the future isn't, it isn't just about, well, number one is, if you're hiring for the future, you're being proactive, not reactive. I don't know how many times that, we take on a new role, and when do you want this person to start? And it's always yesterday, right? And
Yeah.
that makes things a challenge, because then you're waiting to the last minute. Maybe you didn't get budget approval, or there's certain other steps. And I know it's not always on our, on my clients to know this, but when you're hiring from the future, it's not just about filling a gap in the org chart. It's about truly building capability ahead of the demand. So the best CPOs that I work with are thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. What skills will we need when AI is embedded in every single sourcing tool? Or, how are we going to meet different ESG regulations, or, respond to different risk and sustainability stuff that keeps getting thrown out there? The people that we want to hire have to be great down the road, and they have to lead through that uncertainty, adapt fast. How else do I say this? Like, truly shape what procurement will look like tomorrow. And so you can't always tell that now, but the best way to do that is look at people's track record from 2 years ago. We didn't know where we'd be today by now, and what have they done over their
Yeah.
last two roles to get there. If they're the one leading the charge of being proactive and being a lifelong learner, those are the people that you want, because critical thinking and adaptability and change management are probably more important than tactical skills nowadays. We don't need necessarily, even as headhunters or as salespeople or as procurement practitioners, the access to information is all out there. It's just about how we find that information and use it. No one needs to memorize all these things anymore, because we know that the information is there. It's about taking that information and data and finding out what to use it for the future. That's the biggest thing that I think.
As you're you talked about you've got quite a bit of experience in hockey, so I'm going to shamelessly bring sports analogy into this, because there's hardly an hour that goes by when I'm not talking about sports in some way, shape, or form. How do you think about, because we talked about bringing people from outside of procurement in, that some of the skills are outdated, like thinking about constructing a team? Is there parallels with, as you think about how you construct a sports team versus how you may construct procurement teams, in terms of kind of strengths, weaknesses, and you don't want a full team of all the same person?
Oh, I love this. So I actually had my quarterly kickoff meeting this morning with our group, and I used this analogy of, I think it's Reid Hoffman at Netflix, saying so many companies out there nowadays say, oh, we're a big family, we're a family, but at the same time, no, you're not a family, because you're not firing your sister, or you're not, you're not going to lay off your cousin. It's just not how it works. We operate as a professional sports team, and you got to earn your position, every year. And he uses an example of, and let's use a hockey example, and we could use Alexander Ovechkin because he broke Wayne Gretzky's record on the weekend. But, if he's coming down the wing waiting for a pass, and, his teammate who feeds that over just knows he's there because they've done that play in practice so many times. And this is where you need to get to with teams, is you just have to be able to completely trust who you're working with, where everybody has a role. Because if everyone is the same, you're never going to be a winning team. You need to have different role players. You need to have that trust, that collaboration, camaraderie, all those things. The reality is, not all legacy skills carry forward in the procurement world today, especially, or in any world today. Just because someone's been in procurement for 20 years, as long as if they're not thinking in the future, then they might as well walk away now, because the problems you're solving today are not the ones tomorrow. And so this is where a team atmosphere, playing not necessarily traditional roles, but playing roles for the future are going to be the biggest thing that separates good from great.
Yeah, formations and styles of play change over the years to adapt to how everybody else is playing, don't they? When you compare where we are now versus where you started in the procurement space in supply chain with recruiting, are there any skills that were important, let's say 10 years ago? They're just really not that important anymore, and you just you don't really emphasize them so much anymore.
Well, I think the outdated skill sets across procurement are going to be, the Excel wizards with no data strategy. People who, we don't need someone who knows pivot tables, and so we need someone who can interpret that data, not just format it, right? Peer price negotiators. That, if anyone's just negotiating on price, I think that's completely outdated. Cost cutting is important, but it's no longer the core skill set. It's about value creation, supplier innovation, and then this is the number one. I mean, if you hear this, you've lost already. Well, that's the way we've always done it, thinker. This is how we do it here. That legacy mindset is the fastest way to kill any agility. And then another piece that I don't think it's talked about as much is maybe over reliance on ERP mastery, because just because someone knows how to run SAP, but that's great, don't get me wrong, but do they really know how to think digitally, and can they help you select or implement new tools? And what I think you need to build instead is going to be tech fluency, really focused on systems thinking, so not just using tools, but understanding how that tech connects across the whole supply chain, integrating finance and ops and every kind of facet of it. I mean, again, it all goes down to the same thing: commercial curiosity. People who are thinking like business partners, not just administrators. They're not just looking to cost cut; they're looking to bring value. What else can we talk about? I mean, the number one thing that we see, and Kevin O'Leary mentioned this in a few years ago, is storytelling. I mean,
Yeah.
This is huge across my industry. This is huge across procurement. This is across every industry now. As procurement especially doesn't own most of its decision, but it certainly influences them. So that takes an emotional intelligence or persuasion, tons of stakeholder engagement and alignment. And so this is where the influence piece and storytelling piece, I think, is really exciting. Hence why we're here on this podcast today, and some of the conferences and things that go
Yeah.
on. The storytelling is so important.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more on that. I think storytelling is a huge opportunity for us in procurement to kind of learn a little bit more. We're managing by influence,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's really the number one way. I've always been a believer that you can show up with as much data as you want, but if you can't tell the story around the data, then no one's going to listen to it. It doesn't matter how good
Absolutely.
your information is.
No, absolutely.
And that's just becoming more and more the case as we're having to make the case for investments in procurement. How do you sell the story that to a CFO or a CEO that the investment in, that they with their limited funds and looking across the enterprise of where to invest, that they should invest that in procurement and supply versus in
Totally.
sales and marketing.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I mean, listen, I'm not a procurement practitioner, but I've recruited in the space for almost 20 years. And so I feel that I could step into a company and probably, help, just because you interview, I don't know how, I should actually tally this up someday, but the thousands of procurement leaders that I've interviewed over the years, you do learn a thing or two, and you see the commonalities between who's successful and who's moving forward and making waves across the industry and who isn't. And it goes back to exactly what we were just talking about. What are the outdated skills and what are the ones that we're looking to build around instead?
What makes you get off the phone after an interview and say, wow, yeah, that was a great candidate?
I mean, number one is connection. This is the one thing that interviews, this is where data can be skewed, is a lot of people like to hire for themselves. Now, the best are sorry, not for themselves, but hire like-minded folks who are
Yeah.
similar to them. And this is where I am guilty of that for sure. I mean, especially in sales, when you have that energy that's matched and you have commonalities and like-mindedness, but some of the best interviewers out there, know that they need those role players, as we talked about, and they need different skill sets and different personalities to make that team. And so for me, I think the number one thing is, are they excited about the role? Did they answer my questions, in a direct and, in a direct way, but also with that storytelling piece, and have thoughtful answers that aren't scripted, and flow is the biggest thing, I think, for an interview for me that makes me happy when I walk away. Now, I'm probably a little bit biased when it comes down to it, because I go into a lot of interviews, and a resume tells a story in itself nowadays. And because I have read so many resumes and what good looks like, I probably have a bias going into a lot of those interviews where I know exactly what they've done, only because I've interviewed, let's say someone's from P&G or, Reckitt Benckiser or something. Like, I know what the culture is like, what they've done over the years. And I've headhunted 10, 15, 20 people from each of those companies. And so you see the different themes and different attitudes and different
Mhm.
skill sets and commonalities between them. And so I might go into an interview as a bit biased, but to take away from it, number one is the energy and enthusiasm around what they do. That just bleeds through anybody. And so if they're excited about a role, and if they can sell you on, why they want to make a move, and it all makes sense, I mean, that's usually the number one thing that I take away from it.
I know this sounds like a random question, but it's something that came to me. In all the interviews, when you're interviewing for a job, you're always asked, what was it about this job, or what was it about this company? And I think back to my history of interviewing, and you're always kind of, searching for, what can I say to make it sound like, this is the job for me. As an interviewer, what's your expectation of how people answer the question of, like, why this job or why this company? Because that folks are going out and interviewing for, in some cases, 10 or 20 different companies, and so they're probably using the same answer for everybody. So what are you looking for, in that answer?
Yeah, I think a really polished or authentic answer for me, that it keeps it generic enough where if you do have 10 interviews that you're doing, and it's tough to kind of carve out one for everyone. So I would say something like the opportunity to make an impact. That's number one. is, and this is more, maybe this is more geared toward the executive, someone starting their career. I don't think this would be relevant, but we're talking about CPOs here and more senior executives. So I think that they should say something along the lines, and this has to be true, but if you want the job, hey, I see a huge opportunity to make an impact. What's exciting me the most is this isn't just a job, it's to actually build something meaningful, with a team that balances performance, progress, etc. And another thing that I love to hear is, I'm not a huge fan of people that chase titles. And so, I'm a director, I need to be a VP next. It's like, well, that, this doesn't really make sense, because, if you're a director at a $40 billion company and you're moving into, another $40 billion company, that can be a tough move. But if you're taking a step down from a company standpoint, say into a $5 billion company, I mean, oh my gosh, like what does that mean? Like titles are just one thing. So I like to hear when people say, I'm not chasing title, I'm chasing fit. After everything I've learned about your business around, the challenges and the leadership style and what's next, like this is the kind of environment where I can bring value. I like this kind of stuff. You focus on value and impact and transformation and that kind of stuff. And I think that'll be music to somebody's ears. I also can, this is for another time. If we ever do a part 2 to this conversation, then I can actually probably talk on, certain questions that candidates should be asking, a potential fit before they join a business as well, because that's a number. Yeah, but that we'll have to dive into that another day, I think.
Yeah, that's a good segue to say that, if anybody would like to have those conversations, you will be joining us at Catalyst LA in a couple of weeks' time on May the 6th. So
yeah, 1 month yesterday, I think it is.
Yeah, so it's crazy how quickly that's coming, and
oh my gosh, yeah.
It's both scary and exciting as an organizer at the same time, especially with it being our first event.
I can't wait.
I'm very grateful that you accepted our offer to come and speak and connect with, all the senior leaders that are going to be there to talk, in 2 different contexts. One is recruiting for their team, but secondly is their own career paths and helping with thoughts about developing their own career paths.
Absolutely. I think it's going to be nice, because some of the people attending I've talked to or have known for almost my whole career, but I've never met face to face. So this is, this is where the borderless talent, is exciting, but we're all going to, be within one square mile over the next little while, which is truly beneficial for us all. So I can't wait. And I think nowadays the face-to-face stuff is so much more important. We're living in such a digital world that it gets lost a little bit. And it's my favorite part of anything here is meeting everybody. So I appreciate you including me.
No, it's one of those things that, like we said about, being borderless, but you always kind of need that opportunity for connection. And it's really interesting that, once you connect once, that can forge long-term relationships and collaborations. And you only need to meet once. But once you meet that first time, it always takes things to the next level. So, we're excited to do that. Again, grateful for you joining us. So there's lots more questions I could have asked, but I'm also probably being selfish, and I'll just ask you them when we see face-to-face. And anybody else who joins us at Catalyst can do the same. But if anybody's listening, they want to reach out, connect with you directly, where would be the best place for them to find you?
Well, I think LinkedIn, it's every headhunter's dream, right? So my LinkedIn is just my first and last name, Deerek Lutz at Lean Six Search Group. Very, very simple to find. And, my job is to network with people on a day-to-day basis. So if you are on the market for a new role, have questions about your career, or, concurrently are hiring, this is where we can bring a lot of value. And our team, as Philip said, is global. We can help you in any shape, way, or form when it comes to procurement, supply chain, manufacturing, hiring.
Well, Deerek, I will put a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes for today's episode. So that's going to be at procurement.com/podcast. That's at procurement.com/podcast. I look forward to seeing you in just under a month's time. And anybody who is listening today who has already registered, then of course we all look forward to connecting in early May. And if you haven't registered for Catalyst LA, you can go to artofprocurement.com/catalyst, find all the details there, and we would love to see you. So Deerek, with all that said, thanks again for joining us, and I'll see you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Take care.
All right. Cheers. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.